And we continue now with Dr. Robert A. Heineman, political science professor emeritus. Doc, thanks for joining us.
Quite all right. Pleased to be invited, Brian.
Starting out with the Biden campaign.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting campaign. Well, it's the whole thing is getting more than interesting. I guess we'd have to say, Brian, that this is a relatively strange campaign. It kind of reminds you of President Carter when he was undertaking his Rose Garden campaign, where he was too busy to leave the White House and go out and campaign. But he was already president at that time. It's really quite unusual to find a candidate squirreling himself away in the basement and trying to run a campaign from there. But I guess modern technology allows that sort of approach. On the other hand, I would have to say there's a lot of aspects. Mr. Biden's campaign isn't looking terribly healthy at this point.
Now, is that because of the revelations this week about Biden's name being one of on the list of those who unmasked General Flynn?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the aspects of it. But then he has Tara Reid to deal with, and the effect that has on our hypocritical #MeToo people. But also, as you may be aware, he's appointed AOC as his head of his task force on climate change. And people are just shaking their heads at that. Why would he do that? Is this an attempt to try to pull in some of Bernie Sanders' supporters? Or I mean, it's one thing for him to try to gain her support and such, but to appoint her to a task force in his campaign effort here, I mean, that's just strange. And that does then kind of segue over into this latest poll by CNN, which shows Biden ahead nationwide by, 5 or 6 points, and not terribly far ahead. But in the battleground states, the fact is they're definitely tilting toward Trump. And so appointing somebody like AOC to run his climate change operation and their whole approach toward green energy and that sort of thing, I think that doesn't play terribly well with the coal miners in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. I don't think that's the sort of thing that's going to attract their votes. So the fact is, in those states that you need to put together the Electoral College majority, Trump right now is doing reasonably well. And, we're in the midst of an unbelievably depressed period in American economy and American society generally, and he's holding his own.
Dr. Bob, on that topic of things being depressed, we're in phase 1 beginning today of the reopening process for Steuben County and Livingston County, Allegheny County hoping to open soon as well. Your thoughts on the reopening process and what you've heard about phase 1?
I don't have many thoughts on that. Frankly, I can tell you the people in Allegheny County are not happy at all that they've been tied to Buffalo in this process. And what's happened apparently is, and one of the problems with the people in Albany and downstate is, of course, they have really no idea what the upstate area looks like. And so Buffalo, which has had a lot of problems with the virus, hasn't been able to meet 2 of the criteria for reopening, and so Allegheny County is stuck in that same basket. And when, in fact, they've done very well in terms of meeting the criteria that are required. So why the state feels that we should be lumped in with Buffalo obviously has people pretty unhappy. And again, I'm pleased that Steuben and Livingston and are able to start reopening. I think that's great. But there's always somebody, I guess, left out, and unfortunately, the people in Allegheny County are left out at this point. Now, it is true that the county executive of Erie County is saying that he thinks Erie County will be up to snuff by the end of next week, which would then allow Allegheny County, Chemung, and Cattaraugus to be included with the rest of the southern tier or central New York. But that's what happens when things are run out of Albany and we're kind of left out.
Back to the topic of unmasking.
Well, I think we've got to be kind of careful how all this plays out. First of all, the FISA court was established back in 1976, fairly limited jurisdiction. Then the USA Patriot Act in 2001 or thereabouts extended the authority of the FISA court considerably. And this is a court of, I think, 2 or 3 federal judges who are basically secret. And intelligence and anti-terrorist agencies can go to them to get authority to listen in on telephone calls and make searches and things of that sort without following the more rigorous Fourth Amendment search and seizure requirements. But aside from that, it's been very clear over the years that in order to listen to U.S. citizens' calls, the feds have to have a warrant. But what happens is when our terrorist groups, etc., are monitoring foreign phone calls, then occasionally they will pick up phone calls that involve U.S. citizens. And typically those are supposed to be kept confidential. They don't have any authority to make those public. And what's happened here in the Flynn case is that they were aware, a number of the people who were aware that Flynn's phone calls to the Russians had been tapped. And as far as I know, there's nothing substantive in the phone calls one way or another. I mean, nobody's claiming that this guy somehow was giving away secrets or working with the Russians. But of course, the Clintons, and even during the debates, Hillary Clinton would bring up Russia and Russian collusion, and Trump would say, you know, what are you talking about? I mean, I've never ever met Putin. But that's where she was getting this stuff from. And the Obama people then, late in Obama's administration, after Trump had won, then began to make public that Flynn was one of the people in these phone calls. And I mean, I'm not certain where they are able to, why they're able to do that. But clearly Obama knew something about it. Biden knew something about it. Susan Rice, who's totally duplicitous, knew something about it. And she's really quite interesting because an hour or so before Trump took office, she wrote herself an email saying that I was at the meeting and it was clear we had to do everything by the book, etc. Clearly an attempt to cover herself because she was afraid that all this information would come out. But the problem is that carrying this further, then the feds had this information and they kept it quiet, and then went after Flynn and did not release to him information that might have been what they call exculpatory, might have in fact given him some basis for defending himself, some better. So that information, which the judge insisted the FBI may finally come up with, was the basis for Attorney General Barr saying, well, we'll just drop this case. We should have given this information to him. We didn't, and so we're admitting error here.
Dr. Bob, Brett Baer, I think, made a lot of sense when he said the other night on Fox News that there's too many talking heads going over the latest details about the unmasking, and that this is, Brett Baer says, a complicated, long, drawn-out story connected to the whole Russia collusion thing. Could you sum it up? Could you give us the big picture of what we're looking at with this whole unmasking thing?
I would say this, that at every step along the way, you find that there's no evidence at all that Trump had anything to do with any kind of collusion. Again and again and again. I mean, you spent 2 years and $25 million in the Mueller investigation, and some of these people, like Flynn and a number of others, have gotten themselves prosecuted because they lied to the Mueller people, but there's nothing in there that shows that there was any kind of connection between Trump and the Russians. It is totally fabricated, and it's just amazing that the Obama and Clinton people have been able to play this, and the press has picked up on it. And tied into this is, of course, Adam Schiff, your good buddy, who is chair of the House Intelligence Committee. And Schiff, of course, has gone out and on numerous occasions has said there's, absolute evidence, there's clear evidence that there's collusion going on here between Trump and the Russians. And finally, last week or a week before, the testimony before the House Intelligence Committee was released, and you've got all these people from the Obama administration saying, we have no clear evidence of this. There's no evidence that we can consider valid here, that there's any kind of collusion here. And Schiff knew this all along. But at the same time, he's going out making these unbelievable statements that Trump has been acting contrary to U.S. interests, etc. I mean, it's just unbelievable that this guy is able to get away with this. Now, of course, he's embarrassed, but I don't think you embarrass Schiff for any length of time.
Senator Schumer here in New York State said about the unmasking names that the whole thing is a conspiracy theory.
I think you got a lot of people at this point, Brian, scrambling. I don't think Schumer's involved. Don't get me wrong there. I don't have any great use for Schumer, but he's simply trying to cover for these other people. But I think clearly Obama is involved. And last week you had him come out and make some statements, and everybody's wondering, why is he doing this? Well, he's doing it because I think he's getting nervous that it's going to become clear how much he's been sucked into this whole thing as well. And then, of course, you've got Biden, who turns out to have been at these meetings and familiar with this as well. So there's quite a few people here that may well be embarrassed and may actually have engaged in some criminal activity. I'm not sure. But right now, as our audience may be aware, there's this guy Durham, I think it's Durham or Dunham, who Attorney General Barr has appointed to look into all of this finagling, and he'll be preparing a thorough report on this, and that is going to be, I think, really quite embarrassing to a lot of the Democrats. And there may well be criminal charges and grand jury indictments coming out of this. So there's even more, as Trump keeps saying, there's another shoe to drop, and this is, I think, pretty clearly it. So I think the Durham the investigation, unlike the Mueller investigation, is going to come up with some pretty heavy material. And again, the whole thing is just bizarre.
Talking to Dr. Robert A. Heineman, political science professor emeritus. Dr. Bob, a American Military News.com reports that President Trump said in an interview with Fox Business host Maria Bartiromo that he's considering, because of the poor coronavirus response out of China, completely cutting off the whole relationship with China. Trump says, do you know what would happen if we did that? We'd save $500 billion if we cut off the whole relationship. Trump says China continues to take advantage of America while not paying the fair share from China. Trump says he hasn't spoken to Xi Jinping in some time. What do you make of all that?
Well, I don't know. Trump has a tendency to kind of fly off the top of his head, but I know the U.S. now has discovered that the Chinese are trying to hack into, and maybe are hacking into our research on a virus vaccine. And as you know, these labs and such are working very hard to come up with some sort of vaccine, and it appears that the Chinese are hacking into their emails and things of that sort, which does raise an even bigger question, I think, and that is this whole effort of working from home, all these companies having their staff at home working back and forth on the internet. It seems to me does open a lot of these businesses to hacking. And Chinese, as you know, have been very active in what we call industrial espionage, and it just makes it easier for them, I think, to hack into what companies are doing in terms of research across the board, whether it's airlines or other kinds of development of products, things of that sort. Doing all this from home, seems to me you better have some pretty hefty protections in there on your communications. So maybe some of this online work from home will have to be slowed down quite a bit after we get through this. But no, I know they've got the administration really pretty irritated about this whole vaccine research, which of course Trump is pulling all stops out. And how many? I think we have 12 or more labs and other entities trying to come up with a vaccine. So, and I don't know how much help the Chinese are giving us from the other side. I just don't know.
Trump said Thursday he might use the U.S. military to distribute vaccines once they come up with a vaccine. What do you think of that idea, Dr. Heineman?
Well, I think the problem here is that when you're dealing with bureaucracies, like, for example, the Small Business Administration, which is trying its best to get out loans and things to small business, you get a lot of glitches. And when you're dealing with the military, those glitches tend to be a lot less. And so I think that's why Trump is thinking in those terms. And I think in a way it makes some sense, depending, of course, how you distribute it, etc.
Senator Rand Paul earlier this week said to Dr. Fauci, you know, you're not the end-all, be-all. You're not the only voice here. And he was really tough on Dr. Fauci, Rand Paul was. Then later on the Sean Hannity show afterwards, Senator Rand Paul came on and said, hey, you know, Fauci's just way too cautious. He was a little bit nicer. He said he's a nice guy, he means well, but he's a little bit too fearful in this one. What do you make of that whole thing, Dr. Bob?
I think Rand Paul's right there on his latter comments. I think Fauci's coming at this from a scientist's point of view, and in that sense, he can see all the possibilities and the downside of a lot of this, and so he's approaching it from, you know, again, a more precise scientific point of view, and politically, that doesn't play particularly well right now. People, frankly, are getting very, very tired of this. I mean, they're worn down, and you get this bad news day in, day out, and then Fauci comes along and he doesn't add much. So, you know, that's a clear difference of approaches. I don't think Paul needs to pound on him, but he's, you know, he's doing what he thinks is right. But again, that doesn't mean that politically or policy-wise we have to follow that.
With that, Dr. Bob, we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for phoning in.
Well, thanks for letting me have a word or two there, Brian.